Welcome back to the credibleDEV YouTube channel. This is going to be lesson 2 in our beginner's guide to bash shell scripting. And today we're going to be talking about conditionals in bash, such as if and else if. We're also going to discuss different types of loops that are available in bash scripting, such as the for loop, the while loop, and a C language style loop that's available that you may be more comfortable with. I actually like the syntax of it better because it's more familiar with other languages. And if you haven't already checked out lesson 1, you may want to go back and watch that video to get an introduction into bash scripts. Also, lessons 1, 2, and 3 are already available on the blog, so be sure to check out those posts because they typically have some additional information and examples in them more so than the video. So if you're ready to get started, let's go ahead and jump into it. So like I said, today, first we're going to look at the if and else if statements, which are important in any type of programming language because there's many times you need to do some type of conditional type check, whether something's equal, not equal, greater than. There's all sorts of uses for that. In bash, it has a lot of checks that go outside of just the greater than, less than, equal to type stuff, like where you can check if something's a file or a directory, if it's empty. There's all sorts of things, and I have some of those listed on the blog that we're not going to talk about in this video, but if you're interested in those, be sure you go check out that post. So to get started, we need to create a new bash shell script. And if you watched the first video, you're already familiar with this, but we're just going to create a new file here. And we're going to call it learnbash2.sh. You also remember, if you've watched the first video, we need to make this file executable. And we'll go ahead and take care of that now so we don't have to worry about it later. And to do that, we use chmod. So chmod, we give it +x, which is telling it to make it executable. And then we can put in the file name here. So now our script is going to be executable once we put some code into it. Also, back in the first video, you learned that all of these scripts need to start with a shebang, many different terms for that, but that's the hash symbol and the exclamation point. And then we need to tell it where bash is. And in the first video, we talked about using the which command to find out where bash is on your system. So ours was user bin bash. So now we're ready to start working with if and else statements in bash. So what is an if or else statement? It's exactly what it sounds like. And if you're familiar with other programming languages, you already know this concept is the same across all languages. It's just the syntax that's different. And bash is no exception to that. The syntax is a little bit different. Some things seem familiar to PowerShell to me, but overall, it's kind of the same concept. So basically, we're saying if some condition, then do this. And you can also chain that together with like else if. So if you need to check multiple things, you can do that. Very similar to other languages. But if you're brand new to scripting or programming, then we're going to go over this so that you understand it. So I'm going to paste some code in here to get us started, and then I'll explain what it's doing. So if you haven't watched the first video, some of these things may not make sense to you. So again, go back and watch that video if you need to. So the first thing that we're doing here on line number 3 is we've created a variable, and we're setting that variable equal to the number 10. And then on line number 4, we're using the read command to prompt the user to enter a number. And then we're setting whatever they enter into this variable called usernum. So here we get into the if statement on line 6. And what we're saying here is if the usernum, the one that the user entered in, is less than the number that we defined up here, which was 10, then we're going to echo out this. If it's not, so if this condition is not true, then we're going to fall into this else statement, and we're going to echo this out to the screen. And then to end a if statement block in bash, we type if backwards. So phi, phi, however you want to say that, it's just fi. And that signifies the end of our if block. So if we were to run this script, and go ahead and save it, and we'll run learn bash script 2, we'll see that we're asked to enter a number. And we know that the my num variable's 10, so let's enter 5. And what should happen is that this statement is true because the number that I just entered, 5, is less than this variable 10. So we should see your number is lower than my number printed out. Go ahead and enter, and that's exactly what we see. So if we run this again and we enter something like 12, which isn't lower than 10, we should fall into this else statement, which is going to print out your number is higher than my number. Had to do that, and that's exactly what we see printed to the screen. So you can see that the basic syntax here, paste this in, is basically if some condition, then do this. Otherwise, or else, do this. That's the basic structure of an if statement in Bash. So we can make this a little more complex by using an additional if statement. So we can do that as an else if, and in Bash, it's not actually called else if, it's just elif. And I'll show you an example of that. I'm going to erase this code here. I'll paste in some additional code here and we'll go over it. So here, we're setting the variable to 10 again. We're asking the user for input. And first, in this if statement, we want to know the number that the user entered, is it equal to this variable? And if it is, it's kind of like a guessing game. You guessed my number, great job, would be printed to the screen. But if this isn't true up here, then we're going to fall into this else if. So now we're going back to the example we just had a minute ago. So if it's not equal, then we're going to check if it's less than, and then we're going to print out based on that check. So let's go ahead and save this, and then we'll run it. And we'll enter 5 like we did before. So we can see it tells us that our number is lower. And we'll run it again, and we'll enter 12 just like we did before. And we can see that it says your number's higher than my number, exactly like it did the first time. But this time, let's enter 10. And we can see that it says you guessed my number. Great job. So that's how you can use an else if. Now, you can actually check other things other than just equal or less than. I have a chart on the blog that breaks down some of these examples of different operators you can use. But there's, not equal to, there's less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. And then when you get into strings, which we just did numbers here, when you get into strings, it changes a bit. So to check strings, instead of using, I'll just type this here, instead of using equal, you would use the equal sign. And you can do it twice or once. It's going to depend on the syntax that you use for your if statement, because there's different ways of typing this if statement. So some of them have the double brackets like I have here. Some have single brackets. Some of them will put the then keyword up on this line. Now, if you do that, you need to put a semicolon after this, and then you can type then. And then you would remove this then keyword there. And this is a good syntax for Bash, either way that you want to do it. So again, the equals, if you're dealing with strings, is going to be a bit different. And not equals, so not equals with numbers would be NE, but when you're dealing with strings, it's going to be an exclamation point and an equal sign for not equal. And then your less than and greater signs are going to look like these, rather than typing them out with like the -LT or -GT. There's also some additional things you can do, like checking if a string is empty or not. And you can do that with -n, not typing, -n, and then whatever your string is. and it's going to check. Of course, typically you wouldn't be checking it like this because obviously you know that the string is not empty. More often than not, you're going to be checking a variable. So you would have some variable name here, like string, whatever. You would check to see if that was empty or not empty, I'm sorry. And if you wanted to check if it is empty, you can use -z. And again, there's other ones out there, like I said, for checking if a directory exists or if a file exists. There's a lot of different options out there, so you may want to go explore those on your own. Google's your friend. I promise you will find the information that you're looking for. So that's going to be our if and else statements at a basic level. Now, it can get more complex. You can chain multiple conditionals together using and or, for example, which is very common in other languages. And let me show you an example of what that would look like. So basically, this code here is defining a lower level and an upper level. And we're asking the user to enter a number, and then you can see here that we have two different conditional checks. So the first one, we're checking whether the number they entered is greater than this lower number, and then we use the double and sign here, and that's going to be to chain these two together. So both of these have to be true for this statement here to execute. If one of these is not true, then we're going to fall into the else. So in the second one, we're checking whether the number they entered is less than the upper. So we're checking to see if the number falls between 10 and 20. And we do not include the numbers 10 and 20. So if they enter 10 or 20, then this is not going to be true. You could change that by changing these operators here to use a greater than or equal to and a less than and equal to. That way your check would include the numbers 10 and 20. But in this example, we didn't do that. You can also change this to an or, and we do that by entering these two bars like this, and that will mean or. So if either one of these is true, then this statement would execute. But if neither of these are true, then we fall into the else. Hopefully that makes sense there. I'll change this back to the and we'll save this. Let me clear my terminal here, and we'll run it again. So we're checking between 10 and 20, so let's enter 5. And it tells us that it's not between 10 and 20, which is not. Now we'll enter 13. And it says it is in between 10 and 20. Let's try it one more time, and we'll enter the number 10. And it tells us that our number is not between 10 and 20. And again, that's because we're using greater than and less than instead of the greater than or equal to those operators there. So that's going to be it for our if statements. We're going to go ahead and move on to looping in Bash. And there's multiple different types of loops in Bash, such as the for loop, the while loop. So we're going to go over these here. And if you're not familiar with what a loop is, it's basically whatever's in the body of our loop. We're going to continue executing that over and over again until some condition is met, for example, or if we're looping over a list of numbers, then we would continue to loop until we reach the end of that list. So let me go ahead and erase this code here, and I'll paste in an example for you. So what's happening here is we are looping over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we're echoing this variable here in. And in is going to go, it's going to become each one of these numbers here. So maybe to make a little more sense when we run this, but to start a for loop, you start with the keyword for, and then you have the do. This is what we want to do inside of our loop. And then when our loop is done, we have the keyword done, and that signifies the end of our for loop block. So I'll save that and clear the terminal, and then we'll run this. So we can see that it echoes out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you can actually change this to be letters instead, for example. So we'll just do A, B, C, D. And we'll save this again. And this time, instead of numbers echoed, we're going to see these letters echoed. And we can see that it did do that. Now, instead of typing out the numbers 1 through 6, you can do a range instead. And to loop over a range in Bash, to erase this here, we're going to use the curly braces, and we're going to enter where we want it to start. So we're going to start with the number 1, and then we're going to enter ... and then where we want it to end. Let's save here. Clear the terminal. And then we'll run this again. And we can see that we looped 1 through 6 without having to type out all those numbers. So I mean, you could make this a lot higher. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to type 1 through 100 out in your script. It's a much better idea to do something like this. So clear this out, run it again, and we can see that it looped through every one of these to 100. So you could even include, you know, a string before this. So maybe you want to echo out, I mean, I don't know, we'll just say test, and then we're going to add these numbers onto the end of test. So this could be useful in a few different scenarios. And we see that we're printing out the word test. So this is static, this isn't changing, but the number at the end of it is changing. And you may be able to think of some use cases for doing that type of stuff. I have a few in mind that are more geared towards my work, where we need to create a list that, you know, a certain portion of it is always going to be the same, but somewhere in that we need a number to change. We need all these different names to be unique, and we use a number to do that. So let's go ahead and move on to another way that we can do this. So maybe we don't want to print just 1 through 100. Maybe we want to skip numbers. You know, maybe we want to print every number, every 5 numbers, or, you know, something like that, or every 2 numbers. You can do that by adding in a incrementer. So we want to add the increment value. So right now, by default, we're incrementing by 1 every time. So you can see like 89, 90, 91, 92. We can add in a different value. So we add in another ... after that, and then how we want to increment this. So we can enter 2, and then we'll save that. And now we can see that 77, and it skips 78, and then we have 79, 81, 83, 85. So you can see every other one is being printed to the screen. So that can be pretty useful as well. Now, another type of for loop is one that's more styled like C, and it's probably going to look much more familiar to you if you've been using other programming languages in the past. Paste in an example here. So this makes way more sense to me personally, because I'm so used to seeing for loops in this type of syntax. So we can see that we have a variable up here, the number 10, assigned to the variable n, and then we have for, and then we're saying I equals 0, so we're setting a variable I, and we're making it start at 0, and for I is less than our variable n up here, so we're saying I equals 0, and as long as I is less than 10, then we're going to increment I by 1. That's what this plus plus means, and we're going to be echoing out I each time. So if we run the script, we can see that we started at 0 and we went to 9. Why didn't we go to 10? Well, because our condition here is less than 10, not equal to 10. We want to know, we want it to stop whenever it is, while it's less than 10. So when it hits 10, this never executes because it's incrementing each time. So another useful thing to use inside of loops like this are continue and break. These are keywords that are going to control what happens inside of this loop. Let me show you an example so this makes more sense. So here, similar example to what I just showed you, we have two different variables. We have n, which is 10, and my num, which is 6. So we have our for loop again, looks just like the last one where I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, and we're incrementing I each time. And then we're doing this. We are going to check if I, which is incrementing up each time this loop runs, it's starting at 0 and it's just running I up every time. We're going to check if that's equal to my num, which is 6. And if it is, then we're going to echo out this statement. Now, if this is not true, then this part is not going to run. And instead, you won't see this echo statement. You're just going to see this one where we're echoing out the number. But if this one is true, not only are we going to see this echoed out, we have this continue statement here. And the continue statement tells the loop to not do anything after this point, just go back to the beginning of the loop again and continue looping. So when this is printed out, we should not see the number echoed out by itself. So let's go ahead and try that out. We'll save it. Clear our terminal, and then we'll run it. So you can see we get down to 5, and then here our number is 6. And we don't see the number printed out like it is on these, and that's because of this continue statement. This is just telling it to not do anything after this. Go back to the start of the loop and continue on. Now the break statement is where you want to just leave the loop altogether. You don't want to go back here and run the loop again. You're done. You've found whatever you were trying to find or whatever your loop was doing, and you don't need it to run anymore. So I'll show you an example of using the break statement. So again, basically the same loop that we had a moment ago, but we've swapped out continue with a break. So what's going to happen here is when our number hits this and it's true, so the number 6, then we're just not going to go any further than that. And I'll save this so you can see what I mean. So you can see when we got to the number 6, we didn't even go to 7, 8, or 9. We just stopped. So that can be very useful in your loops because there's many times you don't need that loop. Once you've found, like for this instance, the number 6, we don't need to print out any of the rest of them. So now we'll go on to some other type of loops, like the while loop. And you may be familiar with the while loop already from other languages, but if you're not, let me go ahead and paste in an example here. So what this loop is doing is we have a variable n, which is set equal to 0. And while this variable n is not equal to 5, we are going to do this. And depending on what operator you have here is going to change the behavior. But for this instance, we have not equals to. So while n is not equal to 5, we're just going to keep doing this over and over. And what we're doing here is just echoing out the current value of n, and then we are incrementing n by 1. So let's go ahead and save that, clear our terminal, and run this. So we can see that it goes from 0 to 4, and then it stops. And it stops because at that point, n is equal to 5, so we're not going to do this. Make sense? And there's another type of loop that's called an until loop. And it's very similar. We're just kind of changing up the operator that we're using here. So we have the until keyword, but everything else about the script is the same except for the until keyword, and we're checking whether n is equal to 5. So what this is saying is until our variable n is equal to 5, do this. So we should see the same kind of output again. So we'll save this, clear our terminal, and then we'll run. So we see that it does the exact same thing. And again, depending on what you do with this operator is going to change the behavior of the block here, the until block. So that's it for looping and conditionals in Bash. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below and I'll try to answer those. And like I said, make sure you check out the blog post because I already have part 3 up. So stay tuned for that video. In that video, we'll be going over how to use functions in Bash, which is quite a bit different than other languages to some degree. So you'll definitely want to check that out. But the blog post is already up, so if you want to go ahead and read through that now, then you'll be ahead of us here in the videos. And give me a follow on Twitter. All of my blog posts and videos and things get posted there, so that way you don't miss out on any of that. Now, there's a lot of blog posts that I make that I never make videos about, so you may find those interesting as well. And I appreciate you checking out this video, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thanks.